We move now to the third presentation. The title is Sugar Integrated Reduction Studies, and there is a given
Thank you so much. So I will focus on type 2 diabetes risk and all diabetes. So as you heard yesterday, there are from Laura, the different food sources is very important. But if you think about sugar consumption, this added sugar, is surprisingly little evidence for the long-term effect of high added sugar consumption in humans. And of course, you can get a lot of information from animal studies where they've given very high doses of added sugar to see what health effect that might lead to. But it's very important to run these studies with long-term effects. And that is important to examine which level of added sugar that is actually giving adverse health effects, and also which forms the sugars are provided. And when you're looking at different sugar recommendation across the globe, they do differ a bit. And also the taxes on sugary beverages and foods also differ, because some countries have taxes mainly on sugar-sweetened beverages. So here is the body of evidence for sugar and health outcomes from the EFSA report a couple of years ago, showing the level of certainties. And I have listed several of the outcomes for added and free sugar, and then for sugar-sweetened beverages, for randomized controlled trials, and then for prospective cohorts. And what strikes you when you see these conclusion is that there is high evidence that sugar in liquid forms, so sugar-sweetened beverages, associated with weight gain and risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And that is mainly from prospective cohorts, but also some from randomized controlled trials. But there is no support at all from prospective cohorts on added and free sugar on all these different outcomes. So the health effects of added and free sugar per se. So that's why we in the group have been very interested in sugar and long-term health effects. And we have mainly used data from the Malmö Diet and Cancer study. It's an epidemiological study in Sweden, and the data was collected in the 90s, which is important. It's around 30,000 participants, 44 to 73 years old. And the diet registration was a bit different, very different from other studies. It's a modified diet history method. So it's a collection of a 7-day food diary of the hot meals and cold beverages. And then it's a 168-item food frequency questionnaire. And after that, all the participants went for a 1-hour interview regarding the portion sizes and how the meals were prepared and so on. And that's why it took 5 years to collect all the data for these 5 participants. And that's why we haven't updated the dietary data. We have asked 5 years later if they have changed the diet, but no additional dietary information. But it's very detailed data we have. They have been followed up through disease registers. So for this diabetes, we have used several different registers, as well as rescreening of the participants. So you can see that's very important to actually capture every participants that have developed, or as many as possible that developed diabetes through this follow-up. So I will talk about one study that we conducted a few years ago now. We'll be looking at carbohydrate types as well as carbohydrate-rich foods. So here you can see added sugar as well, and also some of the sugary-rich foods. So that these participants were followed for 18 years, 4,000 cases. And what we can see here, this is a hazard ratio of the highest versus the lowest group, and they're mainly divided into quintiles. First, you can see that it's a monosaccharide was protective, and disaccharide showed increased risk with high intakes. You can see the fruit showed a protective association, also marmalade, honey, and jam. There was an increased risk with high intake of sweets and chocolate mainly. What you can also see that for added sugar, no association for added sugar per se. We could also see that for sugar sweetened beverages, these are adjusted for BMI, but for sugar sweetened beverages, it's very important that it was significant when you didn't adjust for BMI and you didn't adjust for all the other food groups. We could also see that for men, vegetable or protective association and also marmalade, honey, and jam are more strongly associated with males, and chocolate more strongly adverse effects in women. So the conclusion from this one is that it's added sugar, no association, but it's very different food sources, that sweets and chocolate increased risk, sugar sweetened beverages increased risk in the model, not adjusted from BMI or other dietary factors. Lower risk with marmalade, honey, and jam. We think that it could be because we put jam on the oatmeal and so on, or whole grain bread, and pastry showed a lower trend of lower risk with high intakes. I come back to the pastries as well. And so monosaccharides and disaccharides, different associations. So this associated with added sugar, what we often see is a U-shaped curve. So this is for mortality in 2 Swedish cohorts. What we see is increased risk of mortality with both very low intake and very high intake. And if, of course, it could be due to misreporting, it could also be that those consuming very little added sugar, they could consume a lot of meat, a lot of fat and protein and so on. The different food patterns there, but it's also the thing with different food sources. So we could clearly show that sugar sweetened beverages had an increased risk, and the pastries, especially the pastries. If you're aware of here, the Swedish fika culture, so pastries could be more of a marker of that you have a social life or that you so on. So that's something we try. We could especially see that those that do not consume any pastry have increased risk. But one explanation is that it's easier to overconsume liquid calories. Yeah, and this just show you the results of these 2 cohorts, the one in the north and one in the south, with sugar sweetened beverages, very similar associations and similar with other studies as well. We continue. We did this with carbohydrate quality indices that was mentioned by Joanne, similar with this. So we tried the different indices that were constructed to be used for food-based, but we did it using this for the dietary data that we have. So for example, the 10-1 ratio, having enough protein compared to total carbohydrates, 10-1, and then also some 3 other indices we also incorporated sugar. So what we did see was that there was a slightly lower risk of type 2 diabetes among all these 4 indices, but the results were only statistically significant in the 10-1-2 and the 2 last one here, where also where the sugar is not that restricted as in the 10-1-1. But that was only when we excluded individuals that had unstable food habits, because we have only collected it once, the dietary data, but we asked them if they have changed their diet in the past and also after for 5 years. So if we just include those with stable food habits, it was statistically significant. We have also looked at several risk markers that could mediate the effect of dietary sugar. I will show you some of these results. We have, for example, looked at some inflammatory and disease-associated plasma proteins. And here you show the figure for added sugar and for sugar-sweetened beverages. So for added sugar, we identify 9 proteins associated with added sugar intake, but only 2 of them were associated with type 2 diabetes risk. But for sugar-sweetened beverages, there were 7 proteins, and 6 of them were strongly associated with type 2 diabetes risk. It's something more with like sugar-sweetened beverages. It's according to the previous assumption that this is more unhealthy. Also, something interesting that we found was that there was an interaction with a C-reactive protein. So we only observed an association between added sugar and type 2 diabetes among those with high CRP levels, but not among those with low CRP levels. And that the CRP has baseline have previously been observed to be strongly associated with diabetes in this cohort. And we have also looked at gut microbiota together with Mario, that has been collecting data on diet and microbiota in the Malmö offspring study. Because there have been indication that sugar-sweetened beverages could be important for gut microbiota, but maybe more specifically the artificial sweetened beverages, so some sweeteners that had an adverse effect. But we tested this in the cohort study. We couldn't see any association with the artificial sweetened beverages. What we saw that with a positive association between sugar-sweetened beverages and the intake, and the ratio between firm-acute bacteroiditis were observed, and after multiple testing correction, there was only one that remained significant, Lactobacterium, and that was we only used 64 genera, so this is not as good as Mario's data. 16S, yes, that's but something that we have done before. Okay. Another very important thing is that we using objective measures of sugar consumption. It's very difficult to know how much sugar you eat, and if you compare the sales statistics or the consumption in Sweden and compare it with, for example, when you ask people how much sugar they eat, it's a large discrepancy. And I think the same for Scapis. You might see that, yeah, not many people do follow the recommendation for sugar, but I'm not sure if that's the case. So that's why we have to also use objective markers of sugar consumption. What you could do is to measure sucrose and fructose biomarkers from urine samples. So this is again from the Malmö offspring study, where a 4-day food diary was used, and the sucrose and fructose in urine were measured among approximately 1,000 subjects from this cohort. And it's important because you have the dietary data, and there is misreporting. But if you combine it with the urinary markers, there are also biases here because there are unknown determinants, not just the diet that affects the level of these biomarkers. But if you combine them, we think that we can strengthen the confidence of an association between sugar intake and health outcomes. And what we saw in this study, this is a cross-sectional study, that higher sugar consumption associated with higher BMI, higher waist, and higher blood pressure, and lower HDL. What we also do is using the metabolite data. So in the Malmö diet and cancer, in a smaller subset of this cohort, we have a metabolite data, approximately 1,000 participants. And what we've started to use is to identify the metabolite signature for different sugars and also different sugary foods. And these show for added sugar, total sugar, and monosaccharides. And this is a number of metabolite identified using elastic leptin regression. So there were some metabolites associated with these intake data, and also quite high correlation if you combine the signature with the intake data. So we want to replicate this in another cohort, in SCARPIS cohort, where the metabolite data is also available in a larger cohort. And it also could be important, as I mentioned, the malmediatic cancer is collected during the 90s, and that is a time in Sweden when it was, the focus was on fat. So what we think is that there is not, maybe the bias is different. So using another cohort, so it was not that strict on the sugar. People were not really aware of sugar during the 90s in Sweden. So I think it's important to use different cohorts. And I also want to mention the sugar substitute. This was a publication that was a part of where they looked at using the wastewater analysis. So trying to measuring the content of different sweeteners in Sweden. And it was published just last week, so I wanted to mention it. And it's also because it's measured in Uppsala, so you can see how the intake of sweeteners is in Uppsala as well. So they measured 3 sweeteners, acetylfam, saccharin, and sucralose. And here is, because in Uppsala it was measured during 4 years, from 2019 to 22. And it is a significant annual increase of 90% of sucralose and 9% for acetylfam and 8% for saccharin. So it's something is really happening here with the consumption, and for sucralose especially. And I think that energy drinks and so on, several of them contain sucralose. So we do see a shift away from sugar sweetened beverages to artificially sweetened beverages. It goes very, very quickly now. And in Sweden, we are consuming a lot of sweets. We are like the highest sweets and candy. That's what we eat, and pastries, the fika. So not much sugar sweetened beverages. Okay, and let's see. Yes. So yeah, I also want to come back to the Nordic nutrition recommendation. And I was part of 4 of the chapters, trying to get everything related to sugar. So carbohydrate and sugar and the sweets and the beverage chapters, but also the dairy chapter. So the difference here is from previous is that free sugar is also included. So free sugar, so it's fruit juice concentrate is also part of this, that you should limit the intake below 10% percentage. It's still mainly based on the micronutrient dilution, but also the dental caries and the sugar sweetened beverages and type 2 diabetes and weight gain association. And as you already mentioned, that both consumption of sugar sweetened beverages and sweets and other sugar food should be limited. So if I make a conclusion, is there's no support from prospective cohort on the adverse health effect of added sugar per se. So it's definitely something related to the food sources, and important to look at the different levels. But that sugar in liquid forms is associated with weight gain and risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But also in these cohort studies, so actually very important to, in addition to self-reported intake, use biomarker of intake, for example, urinary sugars and metabolite signatures. So I want to thank you for listening, and thank you my research group at Nutritional Epidemiology at Lund University, as well as other collaborators at Lund University, including Mario and Gunther at Reading and Richard at Chalmers. Thank you.